Okay, thanks everyone for coming along to the final plenary for the 6th workshop for Ocean's Best Practices System. I think it's been a great 2 weeks that we've had. From all the reports that I've seen, there's been some excellent work that's happened and some great discussions. So I'm just going to share my screen now and we can get started. So this final plenary is all about a summary of the workshop. We want to think about the key recommendations that have come out of it and think about the common threads and lessons learned that we found through all the different sessions that we've had. It really has been a wonderful community workshop. We had 19 different themes and more than 500 different active participants globally, and you can see they spread far and wide through the map on the left of the slide here. And as I've mentioned, we've had 2 weeks of different sessions in different time zones, which has promoted some really fantastic discussions and collaborations, and I think built new links and new collaborations from what I've heard as well. And the first thing that we really want to do on behalf of the organising committee and the program committee is just to say thank you to everyone who's been involved here, particularly the early career ocean professionals and those affiliated with the Ocean Decade for their work in co-leading many of the themes, but also the theme leads and co-leads who have done a lot of work in preparing quite interesting theme sessions, and everyone who's been involved. It's been really fantastic to see such a diverse range of groups coming together to discuss best practices and the best way to move forward with these. So if I go back to the initial keynotes, which were given by Rachel Brzezowski in one plenary and Johannes Karsten in the other, and some of the things that they pointed out about why it's important to focus on establishing best practices. And I've got many of those points here. So using best practices promotes efficient and effective operations because operators understand the best way to do things. They don't have to seek out and spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the best practices are or what the best methods might be. They can find them and know how to use them, and it means that you can also have ongoing training to make sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to how we need to conduct our observations. They can improve system interoperability and improve data comparability, which increases accessibility and ease of use. If things are being collected in the same way, using the same protocols and the same standards, then it's a lot easier to pull just different data sets together and get on with the analysis and finding the outcomes. Using best practices can also provide certainty, and this is an issue that's recently been highlighted through the industry dialogues with Marine Technology Society, where if sensor developers and hardware developers know that there's a certain way that things are going to be done, there are certain standards to which the data collection needs to be held, that can provide them with the impetus to invest in sensor development in these areas, and that's a really important thing to be able to provide that as well. A key factor as well is this building trust. Using best practices means that the data users can be confident that the information that they're getting is of the highest possible quality that it can be. And this can lead to higher funding success and also streamlined regulatory approval as well. And best practices really enable new people to engage from any region on the globe with a high probability of success. If people are able to find and access protocols recognised as best practice, then wherever they are on the globe, they can know that the operations that they're going to conduct will likely have high success. So coming now to the goal of this workshop that we set out with from the start, what we wanted to do was to try to develop a framework or a method for establishing best practices in ocean observing and for gaining endorsement for these from the community. Now, as the workshop progressed, the sessions revealed an emerging ambition that we had, which was to move toward global procedures and standards that can be formally documented through best practice guides. And I think that's an important point to focus on. The fact that are we able to move towards that? There was a bit of a desire to see whether we could. Now, what we've got here is the word cloud that was developed through the first plenary, where we asked for 3 words or phrases that describe what you hope to get out of the workshop. And I just want to pause now. I'm not sure if Ben's actually online, is he? I don't think he is at the moment. So how are we going to go about this?
Well, we can create breakout rooms, or we should be able to provide breakout rooms.
I'm here.
Oh, this is for a word cloud.
Oh, great.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So we just want to go through this process again. Now we're at the conclusion of the workshop, and run another word cloud process where we want to ask you now what the 3 words or phrases are that best describe what you've gained from this workshop. So are we able to do that, please, Ben?
I just need 2 minutes. I'm so sorry. I had a technical issue and I got confused about the time. So just give me a moment and it will be ready.
No problem. So in the meantime, I guess what we can focus on is this initial word cloud that we had at the start, where people were looking for community consensus and cooperation were big things. Looking at adoption and convergence. Language is a big one here as well, which is interesting and something that we'll focus on a little bit later in this presentation. Quality and storage as well. Some of the things that are jumping out. So it'll be interesting to see if people are coming up with the same sorts of things now we're coming towards the end of the workshop.
Okay, almost ready here. Okay, that link in the chat should do it. Is that working for people? I'm not seeing the results though. Just yet. There we go. I'll share my screen. Oh. You need to stop your screen sharing, Paul.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so there's a few differences coming through. We'll just wait as others contribute, but adoption is still a big factor. Partnership, that's an excellent one. Interoperability is big there too. Capacity development. I think that's about it. So a few new focuses that have come in. It's good to just have a bit of a look, I guess, at how things have changed. Now that we're coming to the end of the workshop from what people were expecting at the start. If you can unshare, please, Ben, thank you. And I'll share again. Okay. Oops. So now I want to talk about the outcomes from the final reports that everybody's provided. And thank you to everyone who was really good at getting those in to us on time. I'm glad that it wasn't too onerous of a task, and it really made it a lot easier for us to see if we can pull out some sort of common learnings and commonalities between the different themes. And these are the sorts of things that we've come up with from that. So as far as recommendations for the community go, a key recommendation was that best practices should be implemented for broad benefit, considering the value chain for the required observations and weighing benefits and losses. So I guess this is about thinking about making sure that the best practices will benefit the widest number of stakeholders, and balancing the different priorities of those stakeholders, and making sure that the thoughts are had across the value chain of the observations around those best practices. Now, it was also recommended that best practices should be developed using co-design as a continuous collaborative iterative process involving all stakeholders. So this is meaning that we're thinking about the needs of stakeholders from the beginning to the end of the development of the best practices, which means that we're ensuring that the information that's going to be collected using these practices is relevant and will be used. And this is what helps to build that trust with the stakeholders as well. So best practices should also be standardised at necessary temporal and spatial scales. This is not always going to be achievable, and there'll be times when best practices will need to be tweaked for different areas and different regions perhaps, but I guess that there could be backbone, I guess, standards and best practices that people can rely on if they're wanting to think about a certain observation that they're wanting to collect. Which comes to the next point exactly. A single best practice rarely is applicable globally and may need to be adapted locally to infrastructure availability and societal needs. So we do need to be flexible in this sort of stuff. But again, as I just mentioned, if we can develop these sort of backbone best practices that can be adapted, we go a long way to making sure that we're getting good outcomes for everyone. An important point as well is that decision trees should be used in conjunction with best practices. This would enable less skilled or new users to make decisions around which sort of best practice they should use, or which sort of instrumentation they should use, or perhaps which type of calibration, and so on and so forth, to again make sure that the best outcomes are achieved for whichever type of observation they're trying to conduct. We have some more recommendations around the community. So best practices should be accessible and provided in plain language to promote good quality data, which should be fair. So that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we should try to make sure that there's not a whole lot of jargon going on in all these different best practices, or a whole lot of technical terms that are not easy to understand for lay groups. And that means that these best practices will be easy to use for citizen scientists and community groups, as well as researchers and industry, which again will promote their uptake and use Another important point is that the capabilities and practices of existing initiatives and programs will provide valuable starting points for best practices. So we should look to these programs that are already operating and already have perhaps established best practices or practices that could be elevated to be best practices, and work with them as starting points. We shouldn't be neglecting these existing initiatives and programs. We should be looking to link with them and collaborate with them to, again, elevate these things up to best practices. And this final point, operational needs in modelling and forecasting should be considered in developing best practices. And I guess this is about linking observations to outcomes and making sure that the data is taken right through that value chain that we've spoken of already, to the point where it's providing outcomes for operations. And to do this, we need to make sure that we've got better, more collaborative links between industry, science, management and operations, so that they're involved in developing these best practices through the whole value chain, and making sure that the practices are going to result in data that is relevant and useful. And at times, it means considering the format of that data to make sure that it's easy to use for these operational modelling and forecasting processes. So they're the key recommendations that came through from the community. And that's a good question that Anna's put in the chat there that I think we'll come back to. So some methods are necessarily technical and need to be so. So how do we adapt to plain language? And yes, a great question there, Anna. And I guess at times the technical jargon, or for want of a better word, the technical language does need to be in there, but I guess we need to make sure that there's good definitions, tables with explanations and these sorts of things, and I guess also access to experts that can explain what needs to be explained. And Frank's got a great answer there, so thank you, Frank. So the next points we had were around recommendations for the Oceans Best Practice System. And there were some really good things that came out of this as well from the different themes, and some good commonalities and some good connections. So firstly, there's a need to ensure long-term stewardship of best practices after groups that develop them dissolve. So there will be times when groups will develop practices and then won't be around anymore, funding will disappear, those sorts of things. But I think this is exactly what the Oceans Best Practices System is all about. If these practices are deposited in these repositories in the Oceans Best Practice System, they will be findable, they will be stored for the long term, and it will make sure that this IP and this important information won't be lost to the community. The second point's about helping networks of communities link and develop strategies for interoperability. Again, a really important point, a great point, and that's what this sort of workshop is all about as well. This is exactly the type of community to help other groups figure out the best way forward in developing their own best practices and linking with others who do it well. Another very important point here is to work on approaches to accurately tag, filter and layer metadata information to easily guide users. This comes into making sure that the best practices can be found, so they are findable and accessible. And I think there's a lot of work going on toward this already within Oceans Best Practices. Is that right, Pauline?
Yes.
Excellent. To continue to provide a platform where digital assets such as protocols can be open access and fair, and provide guidance on possible endorsement processes available to the community. So the first 3 points are focused on this fourth one as well. It all contributes to that sort of thing. This is what the importance of the Oceans Best Practices System platform. An area where I think perhaps we can move forward a bit further and provide a bit of improvement is around that guidance on possible endorsement processes. And I'm hoping that we can get a bit further with those sorts of things and come to some conclusions around that toward the end of this workshop. And another important point is that OBPS can promote community-based monitoring and citizen science. So if these best practice methods are available, then these groups can find them, and we'll be able to ensure that the information that they're going to collect is going to be relevant and usable, not just for their project, but also perhaps for wider, more broader global projects or national projects and those sorts of things. So it'll increase the applicability of their data and ensure that the efforts that they're putting in will be rewarded. Two more. Oops, what have I done here? Okay. So next, we also asked for some recommendations on future collaborations in those final reports, and there were a couple that really stood out among the different themes. So firstly, that community leaders should continue to promote communication platforms and workshops to be attended by experts and early career ocean professionals from across the globe. So we need to make sure that we're communicating together as a community. We're working together and collaborating to help the expert advice get out to groups that perhaps don't have the capability, and just keep linking and collaborating to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes for everyone. And another important factor that came through was that the community should plan for activities with a horizon beyond the ocean decade in a way that promotes integration between disciplines, with the goal of maximising societal benefits by strengthening the value chain from co-design to forecasting. So we really need to get a long-term view about what we want out of ocean's best practices and out of the creation of best practices, so that we can maximise the benefits for the broadest number of stakeholders, right the way, and involving them right the way through from co-design to forecasting. So thinking about the best way to do things from the design of the collection of observations right through to the uptake and use of those observations in operational programs. And this last point here is really the key. It's up to community members to volunteer to lead these efforts and engage with OBPS to motivate and establish processes to make these changes. It's difficult at times to find the time. Funding is at a premium for everyone. But if we all work together and we all pull together to do our little bit that we can make sure that we build something really good and really useful for the global community, that'll make sure that we maximise the outcomes and can sustainably manage global marine resources. So next up, I just want to touch on some things that really jumped out around outreach and capacity sharing. So around capacity sharing, it's a two-way street. Okay, we need to bring best practices and standards into a harmonised international formal education curriculum that serves everyone, and help link the substantial informal education efforts that are conducted by all groups. So again, working together to help share the information that we have as experts to people who can benefit from it in less developed countries, and people who don't have the capability but want to learn and need the information. We can provide support in different languages to facilitate local engagement and best practice adoption. And I think that's something that it's really going to form a bit of a new initiative in OBPS around making sure that we're supporting different languages to maximise the uptake of these best practices. I know there were a few different language discussion groups that popped up through this workshop, and I think that's a really good thing to make sure that we're maximising the benefits of these practices. And we need to use a broad range of communication styles using innovative digital approaches to make sure that we reach the widest variety and a wide diversity of groups who could benefit from these best practices. So the bottom line through all of this is that these protocols that we're developing should service communities in different countries and be simple and easy to be adopted by all ocean stakeholders. And if we can keep that in mind when we're developing these things and work towards this, we can really maximise the benefits that we're generating from these best practices in managing global marine resources. So I now want to leave it there and move into some discussion groups, some breakout groups, to think about a couple of questions that we want to get to the bottom of by the end of the workshop. So we've detailed some of the recommendations that have come through from the different reports, and we need to now get together as groups and think about these couple of questions. Now, I don't know if we even need to be in breakout groups, do we?
Happy
Given the
to
number we have
for you, Paul, but you will have to make me a host or a co-host on the call.
Okay. Sorry.
Go to
How many
participant
people have we got here, though?
10. I could certainly do 2 groups or even 3 if it's it. How long did you want to do the conversation for?
About 15 minutes.
Do we need to break out? I mean, we're just 10 people. I think the discussion can be handled 10 people.
I think you're right, Anna. We could probably stay in this group maybe and have the discussion around the priorities. So if I come back up to the questions and share again. So question to the group then. Whoops. What are the priority recommendations for the community and for OBPS? Perhaps if we can break it down to maybe 2 or 3 for each. Let's say 2 priority recommendations for the community and 2 priority recommendations for Ocean's Best Practices System. Any thoughts on that? Maybe I'll throw straight to you, Anna.
Oh, thanks. I guess for the community will be the capacity sharing. I think you just passed it. And one of the things that I want to understand with that capacity sharing is, do they mean assets? Where, you know, you're sort of borrowing, lending assets that accompany as well with their best practices, and how would the community be? I think in there it needs a little bit more thinking on how the community can organize in a way that to make that possible, because I'm assuming that will be something regional as well. Or is it only for methods?
Yeah, well, that can oftentimes be a tough one.
Yeah, for us as OBPS, I'm assuming one of the things is the enabling the different best practices in different languages, for example. And how, I don't know, how we facilitate as well some translations.
Yes.
for at least from Rebecca and my work package is understanding where the capacity development needs are. And that will have to come from the community so we can then facilitate something in that space.
Yep. So what about in terms of the best practices themselves, the methods? Oh yes, Christian, sorry, you've got your hand up. Hello, Christian.
Yeah, sorry for my late response. I'm just walking the dog with a mobile phone. It's very early here. And
No problem.
Just wanted to add a comment about this before moving on. In particular with the language, that's been a thing that maybe hasn't been having the first top priority, but it's been gone through once and once again since we started with the workshops. And when now I'm seeing that in capacity sharing, and after that I see this shifting to new digital ways of doing things. Probably it can be, if this language issue is becoming really a bigger issue, probably we really need to look forward to use technology for providing translated documentation kind of on the flight, let's say, when the user accesses this documentation. The quality of this translation might be arguable, but probably we are in a moment now where implementing this shouldn't be a big challenge, as technology already allows at least translations that, well, yeah, let's say reasonably in terms of quality. Yeah, just that.
Thank you. Yep, no, some good points there. How can we, that's something that we need to think about, is the so look, it looks like the language thing is a big issue, and I guess it's something that OBPS needs to think about. How would we ensure that translations are available relatively quickly? Jay, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to continue with the comments of Christian. We have been testing Google Translate and other means, and whether the repository can deal in their search with multiple languages. And I want Pauline to comment on that, but the results to date that I've seen are quite encouraging. And this may be a pivotal time where we actually make a real effort and then test it with the community in certain communities of maybe West Africa or South America, and I can go on and on. Pauline, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, certainly. Language or offering practices in other languages other than English is now becoming a priority and a very vocal need from some of the communities we're dealing with. It's the mechanism or the model that we can use is the problem. Christian talked about technology, and that's the best, but we have done some tests and it's not so good at the moment, but it must get better. There are things like, asking for volunteers perhaps to do, or looking at just the endorsed practices and providing foreign language versions of those. So there are lots of thoughts in our minds, but be very grateful if people have some sort of preferences that they might give to us.
Thanks, Pauline. George, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Paul. One thing, can we start a whiteboard with these brilliant ideas that are occurring? We've been using that technology in several sessions. I think it'd be handy. And to was it Jay? Somebody made the point No, it was before Jay talked. Who was, it was the comment about using translations and getting better. So some of you may know, yes, I'm the Geek's Geek. IBM, 1990, we were doing the first Watson voice to text. So that's how long I've been involved. And here's the beauty of it now. The gentleman that did speak before Jay was right. As AI gets better translation, the English is still there present and live nearly real time. As the AI for going to Portuguese gets better, it will be immediately run through the new AI. So at some point in time, as Jay pointed out, the pivotal point is really here now. We're at no risk. There's always the original English for now to go back to, and the translation of Portuguese 5 years from now is going to be spectacular compared to today. So that's just where we are and going with the AI groups that and the quantum guys that I know we're working with here in Austin. So that the future's bright, gentlemen, from that perspective. And ladies, that's my rant for that. And I just want to shut up and hear.
Thanks, George. Some good insights there.
Can we do a whiteboard
George,
with stickies?
We have the Google Doc. We can use that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
George, one question. Is there any possibility with those groups working in AI and translation for us to sort of, I don't know, provide some examples and see how it goes, and or where we can collaborate somehow?
We can try to open up some of those, but it's really happening without us needing to do very much, Angel. I mean, they're working from terabytes of data, and AI is checking AI. I mean, this is the thing that's a paradigm that's just got everybody. AI is teaching AI, and we do not, all of the laws that we used to think of are really kind of out the window right now as far as a lot of modeling and developing. It, other than it's good news on accuracy, is going to get better in every aspect that y'all can think of here. So as long as we're going to collect the best data we can now, and our ability to analyze that data is going to get better and better and better. And so we'll even the data we're collecting today, someday we'll be able to come back, and it will all be analyzed more accurately than we're going to analyze it today. So that's all I'm trying to share is quantum and AI, and it's just all converging, and it's all going to come out win-win-win for us and the data intensive aspects of restoring our life support system.
All right, so it's more a question of waiting rather than sort of providing some things that could help train AI.
Yeah, I think they've got all the input they need from the highest level of science that you can think of. Esri and all of this, it's all converging, and it's all coming from, there aren't that many sources of the kind of data you're referring to whenever we get down to language translation stuff. I mean, it's limited in the big sense of data, bits and bytes.
I'm getting what you're saying, George. So it makes sense. So the best practices repository could go through a periodic retranslation using technology to improve. So that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like everything's going to be living documents, more or less.
Yeah, I do think that, and this goes back to something that Anna brought before. Some of these things are technical, and there may be some nuances. It's not just dropping things and always the perfect thing will come out.
And so Frank, just don't forget, Frank, and the original is all there. That the Web3 audit trail ledger system is there, so that should you ever, even some AI may think it got better, but it didn't get better, and then it does get better. So it's now got to go back. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm just saying the general trend now.
I'm just asking. I think that let's see, maybe 1 minute or so, spending 1 minute on what is specifically the recommendation for OBPS with translation services that use technology. Is that, you know, there may be, you may need an expert in some community in that language that reviews this, but you facilitated the job. You know, somebody doesn't have to sit down and translate the whole thing, but somebody may have to check that, in fact, you put a reaction, you put a chemical before another one as opposed to the other way around, and make something or turn something on as a first or not on an instrument. So I think that there is a requirement that the accuracy of the best practice is captured in the translation. And as you know, many languages put some things before another, and if you just do a transliteration, you may end up with a very bad practice. So
So Frank, can we pose the question another way? I think George is talking about advancing the AI and the translation, and the world is helping with that. Absolutely true. Could we identify 1 or 2 teams that we can work with to address the issue you're talking about of the accuracy of the translations, so that we can be a test bed in a certain sense for moving the best practices forward?
I don't think George is asking us to tweak the AI process, that there's plenty of people doing that. What I'm arguing is that we need to make sure that whatever best practice is translated, that the translation is accurate, so that we don't lose the best practice in the translation.
I think something you said earlier, Frank, is the beauty of the whole thing, that there are certain things that are, we'll call it mission critical, and those will be flagged a certain way. And there are other things that are not mission critical. And then there's the stuff that's all in between. And depending upon where that comes out in the AI algorithm determines how thoroughly it needs to be evaluated before, let's say, it goes out to the ether. So there's all of this accuracy stuff is absolutely essential, obviously, as you've keenly pointed out. We don't want to, inverse a chemical reaction and cause a meltdown. So those kinds of things, we have to have some trust in the people that are behind a lot of this stuff, that their mission is to make sure that it's always done at the highest level. And that's what I'm hearing, seeing again from the crowd that we run with here in Austin, that's into AI and quantum, and the meetings that, again, I'm just a pair of ears and the voice for the ocean. So what I'm hearing from my geek ears is really sounding good for us. That's what I'm trying to report. And I think we're gonna, again, it's just going to get, everything is going to get more accurate, whether it's a data analysis or language translation or best practice tweaks that we make along the way. It's going to get good. But somebody else said it earlier. We've got to get some of this stuff, if it's a good practice, there we go. But let's get all these good practices. Let's just make sure it's not harmful. Let's get something going. That's what, not wait for absolute perfection, but let's get the stuff that's 80% or better going, so we get something happening and move the needle. That's, again, I'm just ranting to the monks in the monastery.
No, I agree. Anna mentioned that there's a task team or a work package under the Ocean Best Practices system that is looking at translations. And I think some of these are good recommendations for that work package. And I don't know, Anna, if you want to describe what you're doing or how you could approach this.
I'm not sure I didn't say that there was a work package on translations, but this could be like a task, for example, where we can sort of have a task proposal where we can have, say, for example, the Goose endorsed practices going through a translation, and then have the people, the experts going through with the help of whoever is competent in the language to make sure that it is accurate. And then I'm not sure, I'm really not familiar with AI, but I'm not sure if fitting it back to the AI, so for training will be something that could be possible afterwards, just to make sure that the AI system is taking that on board
I think
and
all that
refining as it
George
goes.
and George and Kristen are just saying that we should use what's out there. Other people are developing, not that Ocean Best Practices now is going to test AI models.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, we will be testing them, right? So we're using them, we're checking how accurate they are with experts and whoever is competent in that language. And then once it is done, it is done. But I guess this will require a constant review as the AI systems are getting better. So perhaps the first pass might not be as accurate, but as the AI is getting better, then you can try again and see how it went. But I don't think it is that.
We do need to be doing something now, because this need for language version is becoming a priority. And it's going to cost some money. There is some funding, that's going to be needed, and that's always one of the issues. But I think if AI was just around the corner, we would point to that. But from what George said, it is coming and it would be wonderful, but perhaps not within, in a short time.
So
may I ask, where's the gap? Because, or I thought that's where Anna was just going. Where's the gap right now? I mean, what is the language it needs to seriously be in? What are the languages it seriously needs to be in? I mean, I know the answer to this in my own frame of mind, but for this group, what are the languages it seriously needs to be in? Have it, as the Goose example is a perfect example, run it through. You have a person who's fluent in English and the alternate language. They go through it one round and they're going to give it, they're going to take their red highlighter and mark stuff up. And yes, you would feed that back into AI and it would get better. But where are your gaps? What does it need to do? I mean, how is somebody run some stuff through and said, oh, this is absolutely not acceptable? Yeah, in the recent time frame.
So I think that, Pauline, do you have already a set of languages that are priority? Is it the UN languages?
Well, yes, but I mean, they're multiple, so, it's not sort of single figures.
Okay, but there's thousands of languages. So
of course there are, but I'm talking about, there are about 10. But,
no, there's thousands. There's thousands of languages.
Yes, but when you look at what the UNESCO, for example, issues their documents in, they don't issue them in thousands of languages. No, they have a core set.
That's what I meant. Is there a priority set defined by the United Nations that we should follow as priority?
Well, yes, but probably, I mean, there are about 10 or 15, and forgive me, I can't quote them, but that's almost too many for us, for OBPS to start with.
Can we decide on 3?
Well, what would this grouping recommend? Spanish?
Yep. Perhaps Spanish, Mandarin, French. So there will be the 3 most widely spoken, isn't it? Or maybe I'm completely wrong, but I would think that that will cover quite a sizable amount of people.
That's a very European.
Well, it's true that are you in the French?
If you're doing it by numbers, China's way up there.
Yeah, that's why I said Mandarin. So I said
yeah.
English, Spanish, Mandarin, and French. So I definitely did mention Mandarin.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
I didn't hear it. I was hearing what my what was Google was telling me.
yeah,
Yeah, so Spanish, French, Chinese, I mean, that probably, Portuguese, because of so much of the, I'm going to call it the ocean because of the explorers, speaks Portuguese. So ocean wise, it's tough, but and a lot of the UNESCO stuff because of the office in Lisbon, that'd be high on my list, Portuguese.
George, and have I got it right that if we could give you some of our endorsed practices and we could run a little trial with your grouping?
Well,
to see how it came out, could we do
what
that?
I'm saying is I am working with groups here. I can certainly run this up some flag posts of the people I know here in Austin that are working stuff like that, but I don't think they need it. I think they've got stuff. I think what you really need to do, I mean, again, it seems like we're going back to, have you run this stuff through and it's not satisfactory? I haven't heard.
You mean the practice itself?
Well, whatever it is that you're concerned about not being translated well, regardless whether it's best practice or the goose or whatever it is. What is it that
it's what we think we might target initially is the endorsed practices that have been endorsed by expert panels, etc. And Goose expert panels are doing this for them. There will be more, but these are obviously the prime candidates, if you like, if we were going to do any sort of pilot with AI. There are single figure ones of those at the moment, but we'd be very happy to work with your group just to try one of those, or two or three or whatever.
Right. So I'm going to go back to then. So as soon as this is ready, so you're talking about, in essence, the takeaways from our sessions. You want to get those translated into as many languages as possible, as accurately as possible. And what I'm saying to you is that's all available, accessible there right now that we can do in certainly more of the languages than we just pointed out, is all accessible, available, and we can run it through, and let's see how big the gap is.
Yep.
And then what we can do is in the meat. So now back to let's get something going now. If that's 90% accurate, because I don't think we're mixing chemicals in these best practices. We're just trying to describe stuff, and the backup language is there if somebody reads something and gets confused. So for the interim to get something going, my suggestion is run with what we've got. Give us as soon as this best practice is in zero draft, first draft, second draft, whatever, feed it to us. I'll feed it to the people I know, and we'll compare the two translations for you if that feels like that'll help someone. But it's changing. So this is the point that it's changing so fast, guys. I'm talking about things are happening in days now that used to happen in years. So it's like, let's see what we've got. This is
Well,
almost
we can supply the practices.
We
can supply the document.
That would be the anti-IBM thing. Are we solving some problem we don't have? Do we have a gap and a problem? I don't know, because I'm not qualified to know.
I think we should put a sort of task group together. In that task group, we will need to have the people that have competency in the languages we're going to translate, so we can then put it into a test and see how big the gap is. So as a first run, and use one of the endorsed practices, 1, 2, 3 of the, I think there are only 6 goose endorsed, isn't it?
Yes,
Colin?
at the moment, yes. Yeah.
So yeah. So yeah.
Okay. That sounds like a good recommendation, Anna. And why don't we formulate a task team based on our template to do that, and then invite people? I'm wondering, Paul, if there are other issues. We will eventually run out of time. Other issues that need to be addressed here, and
Yeah, good point, Jay. So we've spoken at quite length about the language issue. Are there any other sort of priority recommendations that jump out?
For me,
If
it's
not,
the
we can
decision
move.
tree.
Sorry, yes, Anna? Decision
The
trees?
decision trees. So where are we at in that? I unfortunately couldn't go to that one, but what's the recommendation there? The community is going to move forward depending on with decision trees, and for what?
Well, I think there's a suggestion around, from what I understand from their report out, there's a good community working together around developing those sorts of decision trees, who've now had a lot of good input from what I've read from Vinnie Van Dongen Vogels, from the work that she's doing with IMOS around this sort of stuff. And so there's a desire within that community to continue with those sorts of developments, beyond this workshop.
And does that translate in something that needs to be implemented in OBPS?
Perhaps it could do down the track. We can follow up on that once we move through with the debrief as a group following this workshop. So maybe that's a point. Yep. So thank you, Frank. I think Frank is taking that note. Jay, you've got your hand up.
just a quick comment to Anna, and then I have another issue. Anna, the team has addressed 2 types of decision trees. One, how do I implement or use certain instruments in a resource limited environment, ships, things like that, buoys. And they're working on that, and they're doing a very nice job with a series of practices. The second one is, how do I decide which practice I want to use in the repository or in my community? And that's something they have identified as a need, but has not been worked as well. And therefore, that's an open question. Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to raise another question that I've seen, if I may. We've talked about endorsement. The original work was done by GOOS and OBPS collaboration, I believe, using the GOOS panels, etc. But there have been questions more broadly in the community. Could organizations like IMOS or organizations like GoShip be centers of endorsement, that is, have expert panels, do reviews, and move ahead? And I think that's a question I'd like to bring back to this group now.
Anybody got any thoughts on this question?
Can you repeat the question, Jay, please? I missed that.
Yeah, the question is, when we talk about endorsement and we want it to move forward, et cetera, can endorsement be done by some of the national or international programs such as IMOS or GoShip, where they can put together expert panels, do the reviews and all the appropriate things? Or do we have to rely on GU's panels as the only resource to do that work?
Jay, I think that we've learned that already there are these different mechanisms. IMOS went and decided that for its purposes, IMOS is the endorser and it may stand up its own processes. GU's has taken up a few, and then you may have a particular panel or other group. So I don't think that we should prescribe exactly what it is. What we should maybe do is document that there are these different pathways. But ultimately, the point is that the communities like the IMOS community or the community that essentially uses these practices for their purpose, trust them and trust the mechanism that was used for that endorsement.
So can I just ask a question in here? And it is, what is the purpose of the endorsement? So why do we have GU's endorsement? So in my mind, this is to give some level of trust for the global community that best practice has been reviewed by this global international panel, and that's the practice that they use. So if we have, I guess, each program, each institution doing their own endorsement, would that have or represent an issue for a community that wants to use a practice and makes like it sort of gets them confused because there's so many endorsements by so many different programs, institutions, or etc. Or so I think we need to, I think in my mind, have very clear idea of why we are endorsing practices. If one is, for example, say if IMOS is endorsing their practices because that's what they use and they trust, it's telling the community, okay, this is the practice that IMOS uses, you're welcome to use it or not, and it will tell everyone else around the Australia, this is what IMOS is using, welcome to use it, they can decide. But we need to sort of make sure that the community understands that there might be different levels of endorsement for the purpose of a program, for the purpose of a country, or a global community. So I think
these are
we need to have
good points.
I think we just need to be very clear of what the purpose of having practices endorsed serves. To me, it's just a way to tell the community the GUS as a global organization got, their experts there have reviewed these practices and they think these are their best practices. So you can trust them.
Yep, I can see that. That's a good point. And I guess your point about being able to trust them is well made. Anna, and I guess it comes down to the reputation of the organisation as well. So, I would hope that if a community or a group was wanting to implement a program and they were trying to decide on which best practices they wanted to use, they would have their own, regional experts. And it's one thing to be an expert in a subject, but another thing to be an expert in a region, a subject in that region. So they would have their own regional experts to have a look at the best practices that are available and decide which one they want to use within their program. And then think about whether they want to endorse it or how they want to endorse it. As far as IMOS and our endorsement of our practices, we run through the process that was highlighted by Johannes and Rachel in the initial plenary. We've got the experts that are deciding whether or not this is a best practice. As I mentioned, we're either adapting or adopting best practices from existing organisations and adapting them for our purposes, or if those best practices don't exist or it's new, novel work that's being done, then developing with the experts in the field a new best practice. For our purposes, we're saying, all right, if you want to run in our program, this is the way you need to do it. We've worked with our experts and we're deciding that this is what the best practice is for working with this information, collecting these observations in our program. And we're not at this stage pursuing Goose endorsement because we don't need that to keep doing the work that we're doing. We need to get on with doing the work, and we're quite happy with our endorsement to be able to get on with the work that we need to do. And if people want to use find and use our protocols, that's fine, but they can make a decision themselves about whether or not we do work that's of a sufficient quality to think that we're using the best practice. But we're confident that the work we're doing, because we've based it on our expert panels, is best practice and is providing the highest quality data that we can provide for our stakeholders. So yeah, I guess a few different points there. The people establishing new programs should think about the reputation of the organisation that's endorsed the best practice. And there's a time factor and I guess an effort factor in getting it through endorsement from Goose, which perhaps makes you weigh up whether or not you actually need that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess my point in there was more around, because OBPS holds all these different methods, protocols. I'm assuming the endorsement from Goose basically highlights particular practices. So if I, as a new user that's going to start an observing program, not necessarily have many experts around, are going into the OBPS system to search for a practice, the first thing I'm going to look is for endorsed practices. And if I have that many different programs and institutions basically endorsing practices and appear as endorsed, then it will just make it very confusing. So
well, maybe there may be a recommendation that the OBPS, if you identify the same practice endorsed by two groups, just verify that in fact there is communication between these groups and that there's interoperability. I think we should look for a specific recommendation to solve the problem.
Yeah, I think so. And one thing that made me thinking, for example, what Paul was saying, some of the practices in IMOS actually are an adaptation of, for example, Cartod. So it would be good for then that practice in Cartod to be also, that IMOS can point to, we use that practice and adopted that. So then it sort of adds a little star to the Cartod one. And then there's another one that IMOS has come up with, maybe the animal tracking one. And that other group, for example, I don't know, maybe the Europeans decide to use the IMOS one, that they sort of have a star as well, like a little star in there of we're using this practice. And little by little, maybe the community will then endorse particular practices because they've been using it, rather than being just one program or or 2 programs or whatever, just endorsing their own practices. The communities, we're expecting that they're going into the OBPS system and using the protocols and methods that they think are suitable. It will be good as a feedback to say, okay, this is the one that we as a community used, and put a little star in there. And perhaps with time, as many more communities start using that particular practice, then it slightly gets endorsed by the community itself as well. But that's a different system. More like a bottom up rather than the top down.
Yeah. I think the ANABOS or the animal tracking stuff is used in ANABOS. So that is Goose endorsed as far as I understand. Yeah, but I mean, if the community searches for endorsed practices, and they come up with one that's been endorsed by Goose, and one that's been endorsed by IMOS, and a similar one that's been endorsed by, I don't know, the Adelaide City Council. You got a choice about the reputation of the organisation who's done the endorsement and the type of work that they do, and you can make a choice then about which one you're going to use. Would sort of be my point, I guess. And if there's 2 that are fairly similar but slightly different, one's endorsed by Goose, one's endorsed by IMOS, then you need to have a look and make a decision about which one's the best for you. I mean, another point I guess I'll make is technically IMOS is part of Goose. So
not necessarily means
yeah.
that it's endorsed by Goose though. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll take your point. Some excellent points to be raised here, and some more. You've captured this around endorsement in the. Yep. So this is great. Frank's making great notes. Thank you, Frank. And thanks, Anna, for that great discussion point. I think we might just move forward to the question about the biggest challenges that people see moving forward around establishing in best practices. And I guess we've had a bit of a chat about the endorsement side of it, but are there any challenges that jump out to people around establishing best practices?
Well, I can point a couple obvious ones. One is that there's a lot of best practices, and if we get into the kind of detail we just did on these various items on each one, it'll be a quagmire. No, so we need to simplify the process and allow people to some extent choose. We cannot prescribe everything or limit things if we're too top down on exactly how you do translations, how you move on decision trees, or how you do endorsement for each one, because there's just an infinite number of practices, and
Yeah.
I'm never quite sure exactly how this is going to prioritize, other than you expect to do it as things come in, hoping that the community will be the one that self-selects, and whoever is willing to develop a best practice and moves forward, and that's the way you go, but and if that best practice requires a decision tree, then you may work with that group. So OBPS cannot develop the decision trees. It has to be the community. And if a group proposes a best practice and has an endorsement process that makes sense, like IMOS or whoever, and they justify it, I think that you look at that and say, well, it is a valid process. It's not just somebody standing in a corner and blessing a method.
Mhm. Maybe, Paul, I could add one more area. There was a fair amount of discussion of making practices available and useful in countries and regions of limited infrastructure and resources. And there was sessions on it, there's a task team on it. And I would think that that's going to be a challenge looking forward, and would be interested in comments.
So those areas with limited infrastructure and
Resources. And probably, I'd hate to go this direction, but probably focused on what I'll call coastal regions.
But what was good to hear in those sessions was how many how much instrumentation is being produced at a low cost. That was a sort of, maybe they're not there yet, but there were lots of illustrations of, you know, a low cost version of something that may have cost 10,000, you know, and it's obviously going that way, but it's not there yet.
yeah, and I guess that's where what I was getting to around that providing certainty area that best practices can help with is establishing standards and best practices around the collection of the information, but also the accuracy required in measurements and those sorts of things can provide that certainty that these developers need to come up with new low-cost sensors and to really invest at scale in developing those sorts of things. That was something that came out of the industry dialogues, recent industry dialogues that Marine Technology Society ran. And that's a really big thing I think that best practices can help with and OBPS can help with. And Rebecca's got a good point in the chat as well. Saying that adding to it is the challenge of visibility for the best practices that are already being used in these communities, which feeds into the lack of transparency around it. So trying to make sure that the sorry, Pauline.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was going to say one of the challenges is actually getting creators of best practices to submit them to OBPS, i.e. the sharing of best practices. There are other mechanisms than OBPS, but I'm not sure that it's a general policy of sharing best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a challenge.
Very much so.
Certainly there was a survey that was done in biology for bioeco area, and it was found that sort of only 10% of the people surveyed actually shared their methodologies. So I think that's quite a challenge.
Thanks, Pauline.
I mean, IMUS is an exemplar, wonderful exemplar, but you know, there are very few of you like that. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Thank you, everyone. We're coming towards the end now. I need to, I guess, sum up and what the sort of answers we've come up with from these discussions. And there were three clear priorities that jumped out from what we've just spoken about, which was the whole language translations thing is something that we really need to think about moving forward. Also decision trees and how they can be developed and used to benefit the uptake of best practices particularly in developing areas. And then the question of endorsement, how important it is. I think it is very important, but how far we need to go with that. And I guess that last challenge, particularly that last point that Pauline made around sharing best practices, how do we promote that, and you know, helping people to, I guess, promote the links in the community and the collaborations to develop these best practices and share them globally. So yeah, thanks. That's been a really great discussion, everyone. I'm really pleased with your input. Thank you very much. I'd just like to hand to Jay now to finalise things. Do you want me to share the screen, Jay, or are you happy to?
Why don't you go ahead and share it, Paul? That'd be fine.
No worries.
Great. Great, thank you. From the workshop, we've had many good discussions, exchanging ideas, both here in these sessions and in the individual sessions, to move forward our understanding of the oceans. In many of the sessions, the focus was on sustainability and supporting the goals also of the UN Ocean Decade. We've identified key areas where methods are available and could be made more universal, but we've also talked a lot about gaps, and in particular, the discussions we've just been having, which can be taken up in the process of moving forward. Clearly, this is a community effort where the trust and the transparency are essential elements. And we need to engage with the use of commonly accepted and endorsed methods as we move forward toward a globalization. So I guess the question is where we go from here, and it really is up to us. And we hope that the workshop here, and we'll say the same thing in the next plenary, has set a foundation for a continuing dialogue and convergence. It's been our experience from previous workshops, and hopefully that will continue. Before finishing the workshop, I would like to thank the workshop committee, and if we could go to the next slide, please. And in particular, thank you. In particular, Frank Mullikarger and Paul Van Ruth, who were the chair and technical chair of the workshop, and also the team that supported them. Many of them are online here: Rebecca Satoon, Pauline Simpson, Eileen Tan, Osula Adoyi, and Francoise Perlman. And I also, if we can go to the next slide, want to acknowledge truly with heartfelt thanks all of us that participated. And I show here the screenshot from the first plenary. And of course, there are many others among the 600 attendees that participated with us. Go to the next slide, please. I want to also acknowledge and provide thanks for the support of our sponsors. And here I want to highlight just a few of the many. The Ocean Ops Research Coordination Network and their sponsors, NSF, have been instrumental in bringing this together, as well as the IOC GOOS and IODE. And then as a final statement, I'd like to just comment that we'll be reaching out to you with a survey to get your feedback on the workshop. And also, and probably as important or more important, is to invite you to participate with us as volunteers on the OBPS activities. In this sense, your engagement can further the goals we all have of a trusted and impactful community. And I'd like to thank everybody here for your participation today. It's been a really good session. And join us for me tomorrow, later in the day for others, for other discussions if you have the time and the ability to do that. Thank you very much. And Frank, do you want to make any final comments?
No, thank you very much. I really want to acknowledge your leadership, Jay, and all this process and the enormous work that Pauline does behind the background. A lot of the work for setting up the program was done by Paul and Rebecca, and I really want to acknowledge that. And thank you, all of you that participated in this process. Ben is, of course, in the background there, always ready to help. So thank you, Ben and team with Kiko Chat. Really wonderful support. So other than that, that's it. See you in a few hours.
Yeah. I think we'll close it there. Thanks, everyone. And great to have your input. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Job.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Let me just, I think that whiteboard is automatically saved.
Well, that was a little, not as many as we would hope.
No. You stopped the recording? No.